Welcome to NGA Notable Lectures, a podcast offering a deeper understanding of all things artistic. The history of improvised music making in the United States is a long and vibrant one that can perhaps be best approached by listening to those who are engaged now in the preservation and extension of the formative threads of the tradition. In this conversation, presented on March 16, 2015, as part of the Works in Progress series, Mark Dresser and Tyshawn Sorey consider their relationship with improvisation on the occasion of the 66th American Music Festival, Personal Visions, at the National Gallery of Art. Moderated by Roger Reynolds, guest festival director, the discussion explores how the vocabularies of creative expression can be investigated, manipulated, and experimented with by both composers and performing musicians. Improvisation is a discipline that is learned and exercised in more or less tightly shaped ways. Dresser and Sorey explain breaking down barriers in terms of pulse, changing metrical units, and metrical modulation, the categorization of and physical relationship to instruments, and how the performance venue affects audience reception. In the first live music performance in the Works in Progress series, Dresser demonstrates the idea of altering tempo through the phenomenon of metrical modulation, an alternative to the traditional 4x4 metrical unit.
So the title of this festival, Personal Visions, opens a lot of territory. And today, what I'm hoping is that I will get to learn a lot about one of the territories in the vast American landscape about which I know less than I should know. And we have with us two very remarkable gentlemen who not only have personal visions, but are in the dynamic and continuing circumstance of building and extending and modifying their visions as they interact with others. So I don't know who's going to start, whether it will be Tyshawn or Mark, but I've asked each of them to talk for some time. Then the other, then we have maybe a little bit of back and forth, and then open it to your questions. I have to say, this is an historic occasion. These two men are, in their own ways, in their own environments, unique. So let's hear them.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Roger, for inviting me. I'm just honored, and I'm thrilled to be sharing the stage with Tyshawn, who I have such high regard for as an innovative musician and composer and genius drummer who I've been following for quite a while. The idea of talking about my music, and particularly in relationship to the jazz tradition, is an interesting one, and one that at different times I've considered with different levels of being self-conscious about it. And but in the end, there have been times when I've called my music, it wasn't jazz. I've embraced it as being part of the jazz, but it's clear that I've been inspired by the tradition of jazz and by the great African-American masters who, in many, many ways, gave me the green light to ultimately, to be myself. And I've always felt that was, the dictate of the music of personal expression, and a personal expression to both in the solo level but more importantly in the collective level. And it's this idea of a collective music that has always, it was what brought me to music in the first place, the ability to be my best self with others. And as a young man, there were people who really inspired me. I mean, there have been so many. There are too many that I won't be able to mention. But was as a teenager hearing the music of Charles Mingus in particular really inspired me because of its expressivity and its expressivity and expressionism and the ability to take the bass and do unorthodox things with it, and to play the bass in a way that not in a slavish kind of way of being the support, but leading from the bottom. And it spoke to me on a deep level. And I was growing up, I'm 62, and it was at the same time hearing Jimi Hendrix gave me that same kind of inspiration, in fact, of expressivity and also of extending the sound world of the bass. When I heard feedback guitar, it was very clear to me that, to play Ponticello on the bass had that same sort of power to it. And these things that I felt from when I could play by myself in the practice room, that would take my attention, and I'd find myself not mindlessly, but free-formingly improvising with. I started to take note of them and to develop them, and then there were a lot of areas. So, for example, we were talking about, I was mentioning the idea of feedback, which was very analogous to me of playing close to the bridge, what we call it Ponticellos. So it was this kind of sound world that said, like, well, what can I do with this? How can I bring this to the music? Or where is the music in this? And it sort of became for me a process of discovering sounds and then kind of trying to find a broader musical context. And I think in many ways, it's sort of what brought me to composition. It was like, well, what do I do with this? What is the next step? You sit in the practice room and you play, and I had the good fortune, so many good fortunes, but people who again say, give me the green light, the permission to be myself on the bigger level, and I think of Bert Turetsky, who was my mentor and teacher in the bass, and also who introduced me to Stanley Crouch, who I played with, and who introduced me to Bobby Bradford. I had the great honor to play with the great American cornet player, Bobby Bradford, who's well known for having played with John Carter and in his earlier and mid-career works with Ornette Coleman, and being, again, inspired to find my own voice, and also to figure out a way to operate within to find a voice within a tradition, and it was odd in a way because my roots in the tradition were half formed. So I'm playing in an avant-garde jazz situation in my early 20s, and playing and finding myself in a situation where I found myself many times in my career, which has been, I really don't know what I'm doing, but I'm doing it. And it's always been a moment of excitement and nervousness and great and ultimately of great reward. And from Mingus, there were many important lessons for Mingus besides his incredible virtuosity and his ability to speak to the times and to speak and have this really forceful personality, which I don't feel I share that personality, but the expressivity in the instrument I certainly did. On the musical levels, one of the things that I love about his music was how he dealt with metric modulation, which is meaning the ability to change tempo within a music. And so I started experimenting with that first I started experimenting with it in terms of, improvising, and then with my dear friend, the drummer Jerry Hemingway, we spent many, many hours performing and exploring this, both in terms of our compositions and also just free improvising, trying to be able to shift gears in time, giving the illusion of changing tempo, whether or not we really were or not. Sometimes we were, sometimes we weren't. So in my own music, I came to a point where I wanted to start to formalize this in a way, and from the lessons of Duke Ellington, where there were many lessons from Duke Ellington, but one of the things that he did many times in his music is that he used the structure of the blues as a template for experimentation. So I thought that was something worthy of checking out. And so the idea was to create a blues that had the illusion of changing tempo, again, through this convention of metric modulation. So if I was going to play a traditional blues in 4/4 and B flat, etc., etc. But I created a form which, instead of that's a blues in 4/4, I created one that more or less changed meters in every bar, essentially. And every time the meter changed, instead of, I would divide that meter into 4 equal subdivisions. So it had kind of a parametric kind of expansion. So I'll play you a bit of that. I'll play for you maybe, let me play for you. So instead of going, I'm going to do this. Then we're at the top. So the idea, again, it was sort of to create this kind of playing with the grid of the 12-bar blues and using that as a structure to play with this idea of metric modulation. So I wrote this tune called Digestivo, and we will probably play that tomorrow. I'll play you a little bit of it with the trio. And so what I played for you there was the opening chorus of it, and then I put a melody on top of that, and then for the improvising, I use about four or five different rhythmic formulas that have the same convention of, after every 4 bars, which equals 16 beats, we're dividing that in different kinds of subdivisions. So a soloist can play with the subdivisions, play with the changing meters, or play with it in a macro sense and just play in units of 4 bars at a time. And they can sort of float over it because they could still track the blues as being the blues. So it's a sort of a way of blending these traditions. So let me just play a little bit of this. Can you turn that up? Now this is what I just played for you. Please let me know when I should get close. now we begin the improvising on this form. That's piccolo, bass, and piano. Okay, the reason I continued in this direction because it was engaging. It was engaging not only for myself, but it was engaging for the musician, my colleagues, to play with. It was a kind of form that demanded a new level of musicianship. And if when I look at so much of the history of the music, that it's been pushed by people who've brought the bar of musicianship up to a new level. And I'm not saying I was one of those, but I'm saying that I would compose in a way to challenge myself. So in a way, writing to my weakness. But it's something that would make me engage with a new challenge. So at least with the Digestivo, I had the potential. We were working with the grid of being 4/4, dabba dubba dee da da. There at least sometimes it went with here. I said, well, what if I created a blues that never went here, but this was the underpinning of it. So I created this piece called Aperitivo. In theory, the aperitivo should have happened before the digestivo, but instead it happened in reverse. So again, this instead of being a blues in 4/4, it's a blues that goes from 7/4 to 5/4 to 3/4 to 1/4 to 3/5/6, 3/4, 5/4, 6/4. And 6/7/4, and etc. So it keeps changing, but never goes back to. We never go to 4/4. So let me play you an excerpt of that. That was the great late soprano Alexander Montano, my colleague of many years who will be here with me tomorrow afternoon, Denman Maroney on piano, and Michael Serene on drums.
I sort of have a very interesting relationship to my instrument, and to composition for that matter. I think, well, first of all, I guess in the creative music community, I'm known as, sort of this drummer who brings I guess, I mean, I guess you could say I have many degrees in which I deal with the instrument. I mean, it can be a totally chaotic sound world sometimes to something where I barely ever play at all. And so it's this interesting sort of dialogical relationship with how I compose in real time, as well as as well as formal composition. So I guess, I mean, and there's so many different avenues that I have explored over the years of my entire career. I mean, there were so many different things that I've done over the course of my career. It's really hard to focus on a particular one, but I guess one of the things that just going along the same trajectory that Mark just spoke in was that just drawing from not only so-called jazz. I mean, like a lot of the music I've studied during my upbringing was, there was music that was on the radio, of course, and there was a lot of pop music and R&B music and that kind of thing, and I would listen to that music quite a lot. I would also listen to a lot of jazz and that kind of a thing. My dad had a really good record collection, and so I would listen to almost everything that was in there. I mean, it could range everywhere from jazz to new music to all kinds of different things. And so I'd sit there. I mean, I'd sit there hours a day, like just listening to some of that music coming up. And what happened was I decided, I guess late, like around my early 20s, I decided to try to find a voice of my own, because I mean, what I've been doing was I would go to these jazz camps and I would go to some of these programs and everything and get into ensemble playing situations where people would hand me music that was quite complex to play and everything, and I guess I've been known to sort of be able to sort of internalize some of that music on the spot and that kind of a thing. And so I was known to do that. And so so what some of these teachers would do, who are like really accomplished band leaders and composers, they would put very complex, challenging music right in front of me and just, all right, we'll deal with this. And so when we would perform the music, I mean, I'd have it together and everything. I'd listen, if there were previous recordings of that music, I'd go and study them and listen to them quite a lot. And any time that they would put a composition in front of me, if there was a drum part, there would hardly be any like sort of detail in the music. There would hardly be anything, indicating what I should do, right, and this kind of a thing. So what I oftentimes would do is I would ask for a score every time, and just see everything that's going on. So it'll help me to play drums a lot better, on the music. And so eventually all of these experiences and my musical upbringing and listening to musics of several different genres and different people, and playing in all kinds of situations, I was never really closed into participating in any ensemble playing situation. I mean, I've played in so many different genres and traditions. I mean, gospel being the one that I came up in, as well as jazz, as well as avant-garde music, as well as new music, classical music. I mean, I've done it all, as one might say. But anyhow, so just having done that, that sort of led me to composition, and I began to seriously, because I've listened to some of the work of the Second Viennese School before I got into college. I went to college at William Patterson University, and it was there where I basically started to cultivate sort of a compositional voice. I had listened a lot to the music, extensively to the music of Schoenberg, as well as that of Stockhausen and Anton Webern and all of these brilliant composers, pre-war and post-war, listening to a lot of that music. And so it also led me to, I was working with a drum teacher, Kevin Norton, who you know, and so we worked together, and I was one of his students. and he turned me on to the work of Anthony Braxton. Now, I had learned of Anthony Braxton's music before I studied with Kevin, but when I studied with Kevin was when it really sort of solidified, what of his music I should get to understand and get to know. And come to find out, when I started to listen, like really study his music seriously, I also began to discover that there was a sort of kinship that was there with me and Anthony, because Anthony is also a very open-minded musician and who is interested in investigating many different styles of music and everything in order to create his own language out of assimilating all of these different languages, and he would sort of create his own, sort of vocabulary. And he had been doing that for some 40 years, or something by that point. So to me, this was something that I felt was important for me, as a musician and as a composer. Now, getting back to my relationship with the drums, as I was saying, I mean, the drums, and there's something about it, just kind of like a social categorization, if I may, where it's like fighting what the natural social categorization of that instrument defines one to be, where you have to sit at a drum set and you have to be the timekeeper, or you have to be some sort of you have to be the back burner. You have to really be the person who's really putting a fire under everybody and this kind of a thing. I mean, this is the kind of environment that I sort of came up in. And so when I got into composition of my own work, what I wanted to do was to create a sound world that contradicts all of that. Essentially to fight against these categorizations, because oftentimes, as I said before, I've been called to do all of this very highly complex music and would play, very difficult music where, it would be mixed meters, or it would be these prime meters, or this kind of a thing. And I wanted to create a music of my own eventually that sort of did away with all of that, where I barely played the instrument at all. And what that did for me was it definitely altered my relationship of the drum set, but more importantly, it also got me to become more aware of some of the acoustical properties of the instrument. If there were a drum set here, I could demonstrate that, but to talk about things like the fundamental pitch of a drum or the overtones of a cymbal and that kind of a thing, and seeing where those frequencies come from and what you actually hear up close and how they function in rooms and this kind of a thing. So this led me to start investigating the drum set on a whole different level. And this began with my first release entitled That Knot, which was released in 2007. And it was there when I started not only to, because I've assimilated, a lot of different styles and vocabularies and different things like that too. And I've studied, a lot of the music of people a lot of American composers, since we're talking about American music. I mean, particularly the music of Morton Feldman, which for me, he remains probably my biggest influence in terms of all of the music that I've been doing as of late. And so his music in particular has struck something in me where, it's okay to go outside of what you're categorically known to do, or it's okay to definitely go outside of that. Even if you don't know how you're going to do it, you should do it anyway. You should explore that anyway. And in 2009, I began to study composition formally with Anthony Braxton and Alvin Lucier at Wesleyan University. And that was where I got my master's degree. And it was through that program that also I've sort of been reassured, as what you were saying, kind of being yourself, being reassured, given the freedom to really be yourself. At the same time, the great thing about Wesleyan and my time there, as well as currently at Columbia University, where I'm doing my DMA in music composition, I think by having that sort of freedom, there was also the challenge of, perhaps writing about my work and discussing my work in a way that can make sense to others as opposed to only myself. Because oftentimes, for some of the composers whose work I've studied and whose work I consider to be masterpieces, sometimes, the language that they speak can sometimes, affect the reader or affect the listener, depending on the context. Sometimes it could affect them in a way where they won't ever get to understand, where that composer is coming from. And also the whole thing with the press and how that functions with regards to composition, especially if you're dealing with social categories and dealing with this sense of belonging in whatever musical category you want to put yourself in. I mean, that also sort of challenges that, This also sort of challenges the press in terms of, you, the composer, you yourself have to be the person to define what it is that you're doing. You can't let other people define that for you, because if you let other people define that for you, then you will again be categorized, and you will again be put into this sort of box to which, as a composer and as a performer, I wouldn't want to put myself in any kind of box. And so those were the challenges that I've been dealing with. And so I guess maybe I'll play an example from my recent CD called Alloy, and it's music for piano trio. And I just want to maybe talk a little bit about the dialogic relationship between improvisation and composition in this instance, where you have, I guess the name of the composition is called Template, and the piece is almost through composed, but the only thing that has improvisation in this composition is the drum part. But even the drum part itself, it has certain rules and different things like that for which I use. I have to switch certain sticks at certain times, or I also have to do some things with dampening the snare drum and taking a towel off of the snare drum and this kind of a thing. But the content itself is all improvised. The piano part and the bass part, however, are all through composed throughout the entire piece. And so this was something that I was sort of getting into around that same period, around 2007, 2008, where I would, sort of deal with these interesting behaviors with composition. And, just because it's a piano trio or whatever, it doesn't mean that we all, sort of just, we play the composition and then there's an opportunity to sort of take solos and that kind of a thing. I didn't really want to create that sort of environment for the CD that I was doing. And so what I did was, for the entire CD, I had all of these particular sort of behavioral relationships with composition and improvisation, where a lot of what was done by the pianist would be improvised. I mean, there's all kinds of different behaviors throughout the entire CD. And so this particular one is going to involve a piece where the drums are entirely improvised, but the other two parts are not. So I'll play some of that. And I mentioned Morton Feldman as an influence. Part of this also goes to playing cards as well. Like I used to play a lot of cards coming up, and so the shuffling of cards, I think, that was another interesting thing for me that was highly influential and everything, like the shuffling of cards and the order of things, or putting things in different orders and that kind of a thing. And so that's where this piece also comes from. So you can look at a card table or whatever sort of as a template to really deal with so many different order relationships, all at once. And so what I wanted to do was to create a piece that sort of deals with that. So I'm going to start from where the drums come in, because there's an introduction before that. I think it's only about 3-4 minutes. We'll see how long. So, yeah, thank you. So essentially what I did here was, I basically tried to find one thing that I studied with Billy Hart, who's a master jazz drummer and composer. And one of the things that I took with me when I studied with him during that period in my early 20s when I was at William Patterson and going to these jazz programs, one of the things he told me was when you're writing music or when you're playing, you shouldn't really look at it as how many things you can do, but you should see it as how many ways you can do one thing. And so this composition to me expresses that pretty thoroughly, just because, what I try to do is I don't try to find as many possibilities or maximize the number of possibilities before I write the piece. What I do is I try to try to limit myself to a certain collection of sounds and everything, and just only work with those as I begin the process of writing. And so, and I guess this was sort of a groove-oriented context or whatever in relation to my drumming. This is a more sort of groove-oriented composition, but at the same time, when Anthony Braxton talks about gravity in solos performed by people like Warren Marsh and people like that, it's like what he's really talking about is this constant shifting of time, or this constant sort of shifting of weight, I guess you could say, in the time and that kind of a thing. And so what I wanted to do was kind of express that idea here, because it inspired me, to sort of do that in my own drumming practice, to sort of get into these, sort of different ways of thinking about time and everything, and at the same time try to do something personal with that, to try to do something that I felt, that I felt was personal and that was direct and that could sort of get into that. And so all of these different things have applied when I wrote that particular work. But there's so many others, that I could talk about this type of thing with and everything. Because as I said, I don't really think of it as, you have to start a piece and exhaust every single idea possible. Like I want to leave room for, for other pieces to follow after that. And so
Speaking of
that's
leaving room, my responsibility is to leave a little bit of room here for burning questions. Mm-hmm. But are there questions for these gentlemen?
I have one very naive, novice question
Please.
for our bassist here.
Yes.
I'm a bass hack. I admit, generally when I play with anybody, there's always a percussionist as well. Now, I recognize in your trio, you don't have a quote-unquote percussionist per
Right.
se. You have a prepared piano, which in many ways is a percussion instrument. I recognize that. But I'm wondering, since we're so bound to the notion of a rhythm section, could you have the same kind of, as you call it, meter variety if you had to try to team up with a percussionist as well? I don't know quite how you would do that, because what few times I've done anything like that, it could be a problem. Now, when I work with a pianist alone, we can do a lot of things like you can do.
Yeah. So could the idea of metric modulation or these things that I was doing in the trio, could it be done where there is no explicit timekeeper, and you don't hear the grid underlying all the subdivisions? Sure, it's much easier doing it with a drummer. In fact, the last thing that I played for you was with drums, and the drums do provide that continuity. But that was one of the things to explore, was how to, I've always believed, again, and this was something that Mingus really made clear, is that every instrument is an orchestra. Every instrument can do every function. And the thing that I love about whether it's playing with, when I was playing with my trio, is everyone has a rhythmic vocabulary, a melodic vocabulary. If it's Matthias Ziegler playing contrabass flutes, he plays drums on, which he can amplify because he has microphones inside of it. So I hope that I've answered your question in part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Stephen?
If a third person comes along and wants to perform one of your works, is there a score that a person who is not you can actually develop from and do what you would have done? And I would address that to both of you.
Well, okay, so the question was, is there a score that someone else other than myself could interpret a piece of mine? And certain pieces, absolutely yes. Pieces I played for you, they're almost like traditional lead sheets where it's not through composed, just the core material, the first 12, 24, or 30, whatever. A very small amount of the music is represented. And sure, if you know someone else could absolutely perform that. And I create performance notes, and I do share my music with other people, or I bring other people in to add another dimension to it. So yes, but there are other pieces that are through composed. Well, if they're through composed, then anyone who can read music could perform it. So, but yes, the answer is yes.
I have a similar response. The only thing with my work is I also write out sort of suggested drum parts for my materials for other drummers to interpret. But I always, because I don't like to think of myself as a composer who creates music and everything, and like you can only hear the music if the composer is there. I don't see myself as that kind of composer. However, I'm also open to as many interpretations of my music as possible. I even argued on several occasions is that, well, I wish I could hear another drummer playing my music and then I play another part, because I'm a multi-instrumentalist as well. I play piano and trombone as well. So I mean, I would like to someday hear another drummer play my music and everything, and see how that works out and everything, because I'm just curious to see how many possibilities there are with every interpretation. But yes, there are scores, for when it comes to my sort of improvisation or creative music-based material. Yes, that is open for things. As far as solo material, I mean, this is something that it gets complex there, because there's embodiment too. I mean, I see composition not only as a thing that you do, but I see it as a thing that you live. I mean, there's like a certain embodiment that you have when you're creating solo material. Like you're becoming the instrument, and the instrument, you're playing the instrument, and the instrument is playing you. And I see it in that way, as well. So it varies. It definitely varies, but there are scores available.
In any case, on Sunday, the opening program of this festival, there was a sort of beginning stage of a work that I'm involved with called Flight, which has to do with aspirations of mankind to lift off, as it were, and whether that's physically or, as these guys do, in other ways. And I wanted to start this second part by referring to a conversation I had with the cellist of the Jack Quartet, Kevin McFarland. And we were talking about the idea that in this work of mine, which moves between acoustic string quartet music and intermedial thing with voices and projections and computer transformed sound and so on, said to Kevin, how would you feel if we got you away from your cello and asked you to do other kinds of things as a function of these intermediary media sections? And he's a very open guy, right? And he said, well, I'd have to think about that, because I have this relationship with my cello, and I, as a musician, am embodied by that cello and with that cello. And he said, I'd really have to think about how I would deal with performance if it weren't through the cello. And at the very end of our last session, Tyshawn was speaking about that word embodiment in relationship to percussion instruments. I don't know whether you were going to say anything like that, but I know, Mark, we've talked about this too. Could we talk a little bit, and maybe starting with you, Tyshawn, about your relationship to physical objects that make sound.
Yeah, it's a very complex relationship, as I said in the beginning of the last discussion. And part of the reason is that openness, and part of it is being open to the situation, but also, I mean, given that I'm also a touring musician, I do travel a lot and everything, and I encounter all kinds of problems with all kinds of different instruments. I mean, each instrument that I get to has its own problem. And so what I have to do then is find a way to deal with those problems and yet still put as much of myself into the musical situation as possible, even if it would mean not the exact same size instrument that I use or the exact same configuration of the instrument or anything. I have to put myself in the situation in that moment. And so when I talk about embodiment, I'm really referring to dealing with the physical attributes of whatever instrument you approach, no matter the condition and everything. But also at the same time, the sense of embodiment also gets contradicted in some of my own work, as I was talking about. Now, in the piece that I played earlier, template, like I'm playing drum set and there's a lot of fast moving stuff that's going on. But there's some compositions, like as I said, where I hardly play any drums at all. I mean, for as much as 20, 30, maybe 40 minutes sometimes. And that's okay too, because I feel like, I still feel like I'm playing the music. I mean, I don't feel like I have to play the instrument in order to participate in the process of creating. I mean, you can create, and I mean, it's basically you putting many people into a room and they're all speaking their individual languages, and at the same time, one person doesn't say anything at all, but you don't know what to think of that person. You don't know if that person is actually communicating in their own way, or you don't know if that person is ignoring. I mean, there's no way of knowing really. And so what I'm interested in doing is through the disembodiment is getting to that unknown space, is getting to that sense where, you are communicating with your musicians and you are performing with your musicians, but you don't necessarily need the instrument to do that. I don't think the instrument should serve as a defining aspect of, I guess, sort of creating stuff, especially in real time. I mean, especially in, real time spontaneous composition. I mean, I don't think that it's really necessary all the time for me to, just play drums the entire time, through something. Because then what that really says is that, all I'm interested in is myself and what I'm playing and that kind of a thing. And that's not really what I'm going for in my own music. And so, like I said, so it's a weird relationship because I interact in both worlds, so I mean, I interact in situations where I'm playing nothing but a lot of drums, like through the whole thing, or there's times where I would like to really get into the sound of what's going on, and until until I'm able to get to that sound, I don't play anything. And this is just, I mean, because now I'm changing the relationship to the instrument. I'm more or less interested in dealing with the drum kit, not only as a rhythmic instrument, but also as a sound instrument, and also as an instrument that doesn't necessarily, inherit the same characteristics as any other sort of instrument with skin or something where you hit it or something. Like, I'm interested in finding all of these other things in it that maybe often get overlooked in other performance situations that I find myself in. And that's why I write the music that I write. You know what I mean? Is to kind of get into this other sound world that I would never get to otherwise,
That's really interesting. I have a really very different take on it. First of all, on the question about embodiment, first of all, I think what's really different is that for me, the bass is my major vehicle of personal expression. And composition just happened. Composition was not, I didn't study composition, I just made music for us to play because I had a need to do it. And it was something that just evolved out of like, oh, I'm going to do a concert. I need to, and I have these wonderful musicians who have agreed to do this concert for me. I better come up with something for them so I don't embarrass myself. But the idea of playing the physical relationship with the instrument has just been, it continues to reveal so much stuff for me. And it's sort of the idea of, like, you said you were talking about the overtones of the drums. It's sort of like the overtones of the bass. This instrument is just so rich in sonic potentials that it's really what's kept me going. It's just I keep mining, and I still keep finding little trickles of things that are new. And anyhow, so. Within all the minute I played, there are a lot of different. It's an engaging way for me to enter sound. I immediately, and again, we were talking about in the first lecture. We talked about different ways towards approaching tempo, pulse. For me, tempo is always going on in my body. I ground to it. I distort it. I sometimes lose it, but it's going on in here. It keeps me calm. It makes me nervous. It has all those things going, but it's sort of there are many things we study. You try to learn how to activate the instrument in ways, and you try to get better at it, and you try to find more dimensions to it. And the idea, but sometimes you get something that happens out of a mistake. And one of the things I played, had been practicing, and somehow my finger slipped, and the next one came, and then all of a sudden I was able to get this kind of double glissando, which normally when you pluck a note, there's not another one that comes from behind it. So out of a mistake came some gold, maybe. Maybe that's over-exaggerating, but something of use. So, and again, the overtone series, the bass is so, when I first started playing, well, this is sound, but really what's happening now is that the string is bowing the hair of the bow. So those are the overtones of the bow of the hair. Now it's intermingling with the fundamental of the bass. So this kind of pursuit has, and the richness and the kind of 50 years of playing the bass, this kind of manic self-absorption with an instrument has brought me to collaborate with musicians of like-minded investigations. And so the people I'm playing with on Wednesday, Denman Maroney and Matthias Ziegler have explored their instruments in very similar ways. And the ideas of manipulating and understanding both the combination of what the implications of the overtone series, those ratios, and how that the metaphor of those ratios implies metric and temporal relationships too. We've all been obsessed with that in different ways, and I first read about it in relationship to Henry Cowell's music. I heard it in terms of metric modulation in Mingus's music. When I heard Conlon Nancarrow's music, I completely wigged out. It was a way that it really inspired me. It sort of, again, affirmed what I had already been feeling, but taken to another level. So the idea of working with musicians with vocabularies that I studied, and I've been playing with Denman Maroney since 1985, and Matthias Ziegler since 1994, and 1993 maybe. In 1994, I wrote him a piece. He commissioned me to write him a piece he plays multiple flutes and string quartet and bass, so I wrote him a piece called The Banquet. And then from that, let me just play you a little bit of it. The last movement. This is a flute cadenza, improvised flute cadenza. I'm going to interrupt this. So, I regret that, but time is time. Okay, so what came from the idea of this tune became the core information of this tune became this piece, which I played in the first session, but I've been asked to play again, called Digestivo, which is based, the idea of having a metric modulating form. And so what changed is that in this piece, where I used it, here it is in context of the string quartet. So the idea of taking what the end of that tune was, and taking what the materials of the beginning of that tune, and putting them together as a structure to improvise has always been, as part of the jazz canon. You take something, you improvise theme and variation. It's not your normal. It turns out to be a blues in B flat ultimately, but I used it as a way to investigate metric modulating a 12-bar blues that has the macro structure of a 12-bar blues, in which each four bars goes to a major harmonic underpinning that I could describe, but I think just. And so the basic macro structure of of a 12-bar blues and this are identical. So a soloist can interact with in a couple different ways. So here's what when I've taken that thing and put it towards a trio version, it's become something like this. This is the introductory material. This a little bit. Now we're improvising on this structure. Same metric structure as the opening, and then there are variations after it where I've sort of shuffled the deck, as the Tyshawn mentioned, where it's doing the same game but in a different way. So it's given us, another set of challenges to juggle around and.
I think we'll have to.
Okay, so this goes on.
I also wanted to open the door to another issue that has come up in the background here.
Okay.
We're talking about time management and so on, and embodiment.
Yeah.
Another thing you mentioned, Tyshawn, a couple of times is this kind of categorization, social categorization, other kinds of categorization. And this must be something that is a really major thing in both of your lives. Like, where does the music I want to make go? And is there a structure of some sort that one can put it in comfortably? I mean, when I grew up as an aspiring composer, which is quite a long time ago, we thought there were pretty obvious places that we could put our music. Mm-hmm. It's not so clear anymore, and particularly with people who are extending their visions in the particular ways that you are. Where do you put it, and does it matter that there is or isn't a place, and by place I mean metaphorically speaking, to put it?
In fact, I would like for it to be in places where you normally would not find such music. Case in point, I recently composed a composition for flute and contrabass clarinet and B-flat clarinet. It's a duo, and so I composed this piece and we performed it at a space called Issue Project Room, which is in Brooklyn, New York, and it's sort of like it's the acoustics are very nice in the space and everything, and it's a very loud space. And what that did for the work, I think it gave it a certain sort of visceral quality to it that you normally would not get if you were in a concert hall setting. And that was interesting to me because, when I compose certain pieces and everything, I like to see how they work in situations that aren't the most comfortable, because I think when you take situations like that, the performers then of those works are forced to sort of, to deal with the music really as directly as possible, when they're in situations where they're not comfortable. I find that to be the case. And so what I want to do, I just want to play a few minutes of this recording in this room. And because if you were to listen to this work in a concert hall, the effect that you get, this sort of like, you won't get the same sort of emotional quality that you would get in a work like this if it were to happen in a concert hall. So the performers, like I said, they're often forced to find many other ways to deal with the music besides the one way that they gotten fixated with. So let me just play a little bit of that. And by the way, this also, like just in terms of genre, this also deals with as I talked about, the dialogical relationship between composition and improvisation. Here, this piece is through, is 100% through composed. There's only, well, not 100%, but there's a very small section that is improvised. But it's almost unified in such a way where you can't tell what's improvised or what's composed here, even though about 99% of the material is all through composed. Like it's hard to really distinguish, which is what gives the music its visceral quality as well, I think. And so let me just play a little bit of this. It's a very loud hall. It's extremely loud there. So to present something like this, let's say if we were to play this in some kind of bar or someplace, you know what I mean? Like people wouldn't know, what to think of it, you know what I mean? But that's exactly what I want, is this sort of, this sort of thing, where both the audience and the performers are uncomfortable all at the same time, because then what happens just socially, it just sort of unifies them into this experience that, they don't know what's going on, but whatever it is, they have to be in tune with it at all times. And I think, creating pieces like this, I think, and putting them in situations that, that really do not allow for this type of expression or this type of exploration is something that I think will be, in the end, pretty much rewarding for all music, I feel. And so, this is the type of thing that I always look for, in terms of this idea of belonging versus a disbelonging to a particular space, as it were. Like this music, obviously, if people were very narrow-minded about it or whatever, like one would say, okay, well, this should only be done in the concert hall and it should only be played by, XYZ, only these performers and everything. But I don't really like to see my work in that way. These are two excellent performers, part of the TAC ensemble. These two, the flute players, Laura Cox, and the other person is Liam Kinsom, who's playing contrabass clarinet and regular clarinet on this recording. And if I were to give this to like another group of performers, like a Claire Chase or somebody like that, or a group like ICE, International Contemporary Ensemble, because they normally play, new music compositions outside of the concert hall too. They play, in any venue. They play house concerts. They play all kinds of situations, and the music itself, like the expression of the music itself, oftentimes is altered. It's always altered, no matter what place where they perform in. And so that's what I'm interested in, is to have that openness and everything, just in terms of where a piece belongs and where it doesn't.
Mark?
Wow. The opportunity to have choices of where to play one's music, in my experience, has been a privilege, meaning that more often than not, I can't choose where my music is going to be played. It's an assertion of will to get it played to begin with. So any place I can play it is the right place. Right. And I'm thrilled when we have these, rare opportunities to have an ideal situation. It was a thrill of a lifetime in '99 to have a piece I wrote for Denman Maroney and Mary Rowell premiered at the Library of Congress as part of that historic series. That was to play in pristine acoustics. Was just I still get goosebumps thinking about it. And so I think the basic prerequisite is that you want to be in an environment where people listen, because without listening, there's nothing. It's just it's just more noise. So and there are musics that speak better in a more casual listening environment than others, but even those walls have been broken down, as now performers the options are becoming more and more narrow as it becomes more and more difficult to, especially for a young artist, to emerge, to define their own music. I want to harken back to an earlier discussion about, composing for a particular vocabulary, and I mentioned working with Matthias Ziegler and Denman Maroney, who have very particular vocabularies that I've spent a lot of time studying and learning how to express to them through notation, but more often through text description. I can compose for them in sort of metaphoric terms, timelines, but I don't have to. If I write a multiphonic, I don't have to give the fingering for Matthias to play. I trust his ability to orchestrate to find the best one. So I want to play you just a bit of this piece I wrote for the trio called Sonomatopoeia. I'll stop there. This is a way, composing for these guys, and this sort of makes me take back a step to the answer I gave to Stephen about could this be played by, would my score serve as a blueprint for someone else to play it? It could, but we would get a very different result. The question was, could your music be played by other people? And my answer first was absolutely yes. And I guess my answer still is absolutely yes. But what my score tells the performer is not that every specific detail. It talks about vocabulary, it talks about range, it talks about relative densities. But even we will perform it differently every night that we play it. In fact, we will play this on Wednesday afternoon. I'll leave it at there.
I think we should probably leave a few moments for any questions in the audience. And if there aren't a lot, then I would like to ask Tyshawn and Mark to ask each other questions. And if you can't come up with any, I can. So anybody have something that they've been wondering about? Yes, please.
Thank you for that discussion. You were, one thing you were talking about that was really speaking to me was about presenting the music in various different places. It sounds like for you, Tyshawn, it's more of a question of playing this music outside of the formal concert hall. And whereas there is this trend now of non-idiomatic musicians who are performing in alternative spaces and who are having more access to putting together presentations that are varied musically, to artistically, aesthetically. But for me, the challenge always seems to really get people to know that this music is around, that there are people that are starkly not beholden to any sort of particular box. They're trying to express themselves or present their own originality through their work that doesn't necessarily isn't beholden to any particular genre. So I'd like to know sort of like how you've been able to sort of navigate that realm. Like, I don't know how much you've done in terms of putting together your own presentation to create these situations where you really, or if you even feel like you have to reach out to other people exploring, I guess, even more popular genres to sort of bring them in to what you're doing, just through the press or through the audience or through fellow musicians. That's for both, for all three.
Well, this is a whole range of extremely interesting and important questions. Can you try, Tyshawn, to sort of...
Okay, well, given that there is a trend out here of composers and different people presenting music in venues that are other than concert halls and things like that, given that there is a growing trend of that going on, the question was, how did I come to the point of thinking of the performance of my compositions in certain venues? The question is, how did I come to this, way of thinking? I guess my answer is through my compositions in improvisational music, where I first when I first worked with Anthony Braxton. This goes back to my meeting him in 2002 sometime, where we did a recording together of a saxophone student of his. We did a recording together, and so I was talking to him, and I had by that point had written some like maybe 5 or 6 tunes or whatever for for like a jazz quintet or something like that, none of which I liked. And so what I did was I told him about this, and and I was having a lot of trouble, kind of rehearsing some of this music. I mean, I didn't have any particular players in mind who I wrote for. I would just write these things, and they would oftentimes, there would be some difficulty with performing the music, because that's just how I heard things. But then I got discouraged, and I felt like, well, this isn't going to happen now. You know what I mean? So I may as well just give up composing and just be this, working drummer or something, and that would be it. And what Anthony told me was that, well, no, you should keep writing the music you're writing and keep writing everything you're hearing, because if there is one person out there who can do the music, then you give the music to that person and then have them play with you and this and that. And so this proceeded into a book of some 40 compositions for this jazz quintet that's known to some as the Group Oblique. There's some 40 compositions that are in that book, and they're very rigorous. The music is very rigorous harmonically. It's very challenging technically, at least for saxophone players. It's very challenging music. It's a whole other way of dealing. And so we would perform this music in this club called Zebulon. They were the first people to give me a performance opportunity anywhere. And so I presented this music for the first time, for the first time in this club. There's people drinking and there's people like just sort of mingling in there, but the owners there of the club, these were a couple of French intellectual guys or whatever, like kind of running this place. And, so we're sitting there having beer, and they were telling me about how they were so much into the music that they've heard nothing like that in that club before and this and that. And so they invited us back. And so we kept performing there for we played there maybe twice a month. And word had gotten out, that we would be performing this really complicated sort of, this chamber sort of music or whatever in this space, where there's all this drinking and there's all this stuff happening. But we were able to develop our language. This went on for some maybe couple of years, like that. We would be there sometimes, sometimes once a month, sometimes twice a month, give or take a few days. But ultimately, this is when I thought, wow. So I don't necessarily have to present this music, at a jazz venue, a so-called jazz venue, or a venue that's sort of established as, as something that's created to present music of that medium. I can present this music anywhere, and then people started getting more into it. More people started coming to the concert, and then it got to a point where people only came to see that concert, at the bar, at this bar, so it's like, well, okay, so that got me to start writing for other configurations and for other types of ensembles and everything. And I figured, well, let me try this for, some other groups and everything. And so far that has been really successful for me, and it's been refreshing with every result. You have anything to add? Or
also getting the word out. I think that's another thing that I think it's an issue for everything now which is not already in a box. How do we disseminate information? About events? How do we disseminate the records, the things which would have happened? How do we try to capture something? Mark and I actually gave a course a couple of years ago called Transcending Place and Time, and wrestling with this stuff. So not metaphysically, but practically. What do you do? How do you get the word out?
Ultimately, one has to perform for music to come to life. And any way possible has been my MO. So you because the music happens with people there, and any opportunity has been a good opportunity for the music to grow and develop, and for me to have the opportunity to grow it, and how to get the word out. Well, that this is the domain of PR experts. But one thing that I really learned, from Roger, is the importance of always thinking of what the ideal situation is. So often we're put in situations, well, how can I just get the job done? Rather than thinking, well, what would be the optimum way to go there, and start working there, start at that and pushing that as hard as you can, and then see, well, okay, what is possible? Rather than say, well, I'm going to make something happen, let's call Joe to record it. Rather than doing everything on the, guerrilla warfare level, so that's the short answer.
Quick question. We have to end, but maybe this will be the last question.
The flip side of that is, how does the audience find you?
Well, That's a good question, and and this is one that social media, the word gets out, you're here, it just happens by being persistent, and consequent in your actions, and that someone knows that, oh, this is a person of consequence.
Thank you.
This has been a National Gallery of Art podcast.